I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week, we'll be speaking with the author and journalist Jeff Kisseloff about his new book. It challenges the conviction of Alger Hiss. It was a case that ignited the McCarthy era and still divides historians. But first, let's turn to the high-stakes race for New York City's next mayor. Mayor Eric Adams now running as an independent after federal corruption charges against him were dismissed. Meanwhile, Andrew Cuomo, Zoran Mamdani are leading a crowded field in next month's Democratic primary. Here with the latest, Jeffrey Mays, Metro reporter for the New York Times. Jeffrey, is the election, the nomination, Andrew Cuomo's to lose, and is he doing everything right so he doesn't lose it?
Well, I think, a lot of polls have him at 34, 35%, and he is trailed by Zoran Mamdani is behind him with, 15, 16%. So he certainly is the front runner at the moment. He has a very strong lead. Beneath Cuomo and Mamdani are a group of candidates who have kind of been mired in the muck a bit. You have Zelnor Myrie, who's the state senator from Brooklyn, Brad Lander, the city comptroller, Scott Stringer, the former city comptroller, and then you have Adrian Adams, the city council speaker. It's still early. As you said, it's May. The primary is on June 24th. And, people should be reminded in the past couple of mayoral elections, we've had candidates that have come from behind. Last time it was Catherine Garcia, who sort of came out of nowhere to challenge Eric Adams and just lost by a few thousand votes. And a few years ago it was Bill de Blasio, who came up and surprised everyone and won the race.
Jeffrey, you pointed out in the Times recently that Andrew Cuomo is running what amounts to a rose garden campaign, limiting himself very much to public exposure. How long can he keep that up? Doesn't he have to participate in debates and other things?
Absolutely. I think he can't keep that up much longer. There's been a lot of criticism about where he's been. Why hasn't he been on stage answering these questions with the rest of his fellow candidates? I think moving forward, what they've tried to do is sort of create this air of inevitability that, I'm at 30 some odd percent in the polls, we're late in the race, I'm going to win. And I think other candidates are desperate. They've been hitting at Governor Cuomo in their ads, in their speeches. So they are desperate to get him on stage. There are two required forums for those who participate in the city's matching fund program. Those are both in June, so those are going to be two debates where we definitely know the governor will be on stage with his fellow candidates. But as of now, he's been avoiding them. Formats have been set up so that each candidate is on the stage individually, and those where they're all on the stage together, he has declined to appear.
Doesn't that strategy make him look arrogant?
Look, I think he's coming into the race with the argument that I have the most executive experience. I've been the governor, I've headed HUD, I've been the attorney general, I've run things, I know how to run things, and what the city is in desperate need now is a manager. That's been his argument. And I think they are, it makes sense as a front runner to try to keep people at arm's length. The problem is, that strategy has been questioned repeatedly, and I think even the campaign realizes that to be mayor of New York City is to sort of be out in the public, to be out talking to people, and that you cannot run for mayor as if you're a governor.
Why is Zoran Mamdani doing as well as he is? He is very much a left-wing candidate, whether you approve of that or not. His position on the Mideast is certainly controversial in this city. Why is he running second?
Well, I think it's actually a surprise that he's running second. He was not very well known outside of his district. He's a, pretty unknown state legislator. I think he has really leaned into his sort of left leanings. If you look at his proposals, free buses, for example, he proposed to freeze the rent on rent stabilized units. He's really leaning into that sort of democratic socialist plank. And I think people are responding to that. On top of that, there are a couple other things. He's excellent at social media. He's done a bunch of ads and campaigns that have really gone viral on social media. Everything from him breaking Ramadan fast, eating a burrito on the subway, to being outside of Madison Square Garden, talking to Knicks fans. And then, there's some people think he's a handsome guy too. That doesn't hurt him at all.
Doesn't hurt him. You pointed out in the Times the other day too that other candidates who seem to have a lot of credentials on paper have not really caught on. One of them, Zelnor Myrie. Why not?
Well, I think part of the problem is name recognition. Governor Cuomo comes into this race with almost universal name recognition. Everyone knows who he is, and they have an opinion of him, whether it's good or bad, but they know who he is. Someone like Zelnor Myrie, who represents a Senate district in Brooklyn, is not that widely known outside of his district, even though he actually seems to be a good candidate. He has great accomplishments in the legislature on
Very
housing,
well respected.
very well respected, voting rights, gun legislation. But I think that name recognition is partly what's holding a lot of people back. Now, they think that we're towards the end of the race. Someone like Zelnor has fundraised well. He released his first ad the other day. So they think that there's an opportunity to sort of introduce themselves to voters. And that's something that not only someone like Zelnor thinks, but other candidates like Adrian Adams, Brad Lander, Scott Stringer also hope those ads will help increase their name recognition.
Mayor Adams no longer in the Democratic primary. Where does his support go for the Democratic nomination?
I think there's Andrew Cuomo has really tried to subsume all of the mayor's support. He made a point early on of unveiling endorsement after endorsement from black elected leaders, specifically black women, and he's lapping up older voters, voters in the sort of outer boroughs, white voters in places like Staten Island and Queens. So Governor Cuomo has really come in, really taking up a lot of that base. He has competition for that base, though, from someone like Zelnor Myrie for black votes. Adrian Adams certainly has a very similar base to Mayor Adams from Southeast Queens, a moderate Democrat and middle class, and she's focused on helping the working poor as the city council speaker. So there is competition for that base, but the governor has really so far gathered a lot of the mayor's former base.
What is the outlook for November with the mayor running as an independent? It seems like there's the potential for a more contested race in the general election than usual.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this particular contest is that normally the Democratic primary is where the mayor has been decided historically, except in a few instances in the past few decades. And what we're going to see in November is we're going to see an actual election in November. So you'll have someone like Eric Adams running as an independent. I believe Jim Walden, who's an attorney, is also going to be on the ballot. The Working Family Party, which is sort of the left-leaning faction of the Democratic Party, they've said that if Andrew Cuomo wins the Democratic primary, they may likely have a candidate in the general election. So you'll have that along with the Democratic nominee and Curtis Sliwa, the likely Republican nominee. So it will be a choice for voters to make, which will be unusual. And it won't be a ranked choice situation either. It'll be whoever gets the plurality of votes will win the election.
And all those people running might be good for the Democrat if it is Andrew Cuomo, because it would split the opposition, presumably.
Right, and he's going to, be in competition certainly with Eric Adams for that base. Who's that base going to settle on? Are they going to forgive Eric Adams and some of the problems he have, or are they going to move on and go with Governor Cuomo? So it's going to be interesting in November because we normally don't have that here. Normally, the winner of the Democratic primary goes on to become mayor.
What's going to be, this is obviously a very hypothetical question, but with 7 or so weeks left until the primary, what is going to be the defining issue, event that's going to determine the outcome, do you think?
Well, I think a couple of issues have been rising up. One is affordability, how difficult it is to afford to live in the city. Another is childcare. A lot of the candidates now have sort of begun unveiling proposals. Zelnor Myrie has a proposal for universal after-school care, for example. Other candidates are proposing to expand universal pre-K, which has sort of suffered a bit under Mayor Adams in terms of reductions. So those issues, I think the candidates that can speak to those particular issues are going to be the candidates that are going to gain traction. And again, I think that's one of the reasons Mr. Mamdani has sort of had traction so far, is he's talking about very basic sort of pocketbook issues in terms of how people's quality of lives are affected in New York City.
The mayor is making a big deal about his budget proposal. Critics are already saying he's relying too much on the federal government when there's such a great deal of uncertainty. in terms of what it's going to do, what it's going to claw back, and also the state, of course, which is also dependent on Washington. Is the mayor going too far out on a limb, and how is the council going to react to that?
Yeah, I think the council has raised some of those concerns about depending too much on federal aid. They've also sort of put out a cry that they want to fight any incoming cuts from Washington. We've already seen a situation where the federal government has gone in and seized $80 million from the city's bank accounts that was given to help care for migrants. There's a lawsuit to try to get that money back. And we know with the Trump administration's priorities, we can already see that there are going to be funding cuts in every area, from education to even transportation, for example. So I think the plan, this is going to be an important budget for the city. The mayor is going to have to negotiate with one of his rivals, Adrian Adams, who's running against him. And so I think the question is, how do you mitigate for those federal cuts? The city does have a rainy day fund, but we'll see how they utilize it.
And how is the mayor going to raise money for this campaign? As you pointed out, he has been faltering in that a great deal so far.
Yeah, he's been struggling in the fundraising area, hasn't been able to raise money to pay off his sort of legal bills. That stopped, and some of the campaign fundraising has also stopped. He was really damaged by this indictment and even subsequently by the dismissal of the indictment, and the questions of what he did to get that dismissal have really hurt his opportunities. But he is out fundraising. He had a fundraising the other day at a dispensary, a marijuana dispensary that one of my colleagues wrote about, not far from Gracie Mansion. And there are always going to want to be people that want to get close to the mayor. So there's a pool there that he could draw from, and he's a savvy politician as well.
He is indeed. Jeffrey Mays of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next, Jeff Kisseloff discusses his latest book on the landmark Alger Hiss spy case. Joining the conversation, Alger's son, Tony Hiss. The conviction of Alger Hiss remains one of the most controversial espionage cases in American history. It triggered the McCarthy era and forever changed our political landscape. Veteran journalist and author Jeff Kisseloff's new book is Rewriting History, Hisstory. He joins us now along with Alger's son, the author and journalist Tony Hiss. Welcome, and thanks to both of you for joining us. Jeff, this was a very personal journey for you. You've written a couple of books on oral histories. This was sort of a personal history. Tell us why this odyssey in looking into Alger Hiss's guilt or innocence was so personal.
It started with my parents, who were Democrat Republicans, liberal Democrats, and we knew about the Hiss case just growing up. The Hiss case was just a part of our lives, talking about politics when around the table. I'd always been fascinated by the case.
And you said you heard Edward R. Murrow on Can You Hear It Now? And he said, referring to Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers, one of these two men is the greatest liar in American history. Did you think from the beginning that it was Whittaker Chambers that was lying?
I had no idea. It was just, wow, one of these two people were the greatest liar. Who was it? I had no idea. But in 1960, I was online with my mother. She was voting in the Democratic election, and a man turned around and looked at me he must have been 10 feet tall. Of course, I was this big. And he said, "Who are you voting for, Sonny?" And I said, "We're voting for Kennedy. We hate Nixon." And my mother was completely horrified. But I guess that was ingrained in you. And going to college in Massachusetts in the 1970s, Richard Nixon's guilt in Watergate and despising Richard Nixon was like granola or something like that. It was just accepted. But I'm a journalist by nature, I guess, and I needed to know the truth. And I never was sure until I started to really research the case, what was really going on here. And people would ask me all the time, they'd say, "How would you stay working with this guy who was guilty?" And I said, "Well, I don't think he is, but if I felt he was guilty, I'd get up and walk out the door."
Tony, you wrote a terrific book on your own, The View from Alger's Window. You Jeff said in his book that your father, Alger Hiss, was not bitter about Richard Nixon and the other people who accused him. How could he not have been bitter, considering how much it affected his life?
Well, because he was an unusual person, Sam. He had things that I aspire to. He liked to say that getting 3 years in prison was worth a good way of getting rid of 3 years at Harvard. He used prison as a chance to grow as a person. That's unusual.
It certainly is. One of the things you said in your book, and I remember interviewing you at the time, was that he was a wonderful father. And Jeff says he was a wonderful colleague, person as well. But couldn't he have been a wonderful father and a spy?
I suppose so. But I don't think he had, well, if he was the greatest liar in history, he certainly was the greatest liar throughout my lifetime, because nothing in him seemed to reflect anything other than his being a devout, card-carrying, New Deal Democrat. He was so proud of having been the first Secretary General of the United Nations at their organizing conference. And the whole thought among the Roosevelt types was that had the president lived, the UN would be a way of sort of taking the New Deal on the road around the world and helping. I don't think they had any illusions about the nastiness of the Russian regime, but they thought, nevertheless, we're all in one world and we could make a go of it.
Jeff, you said he emerged from prison even more liberal than when he went in. Why was that?
I think his perspective was wider. He got to know people a little bit better. He used to say to me that he was an arrogant person during the New Deal, and he got over that pretty quickly. I remember him telling me they had dinner with Ralph Bunche one night, and he invited the maid to sit at the table, thinking this was something she would like to do. He was horrified, by that. But he just had a way about him that Tony reflects. I remember walking down the street with him one day, and a homeless guy came up to us and asked for money. And Alger reached into his pocket, gave him change, and then said this thing which I'd never heard anybody ever ask before. He said, "Is that enough?" The homeless guy looked at him like, "What's this about?" And I always thought that that was the window into his relationship to Whittaker Chambers. And when he talked about taking in Whittaker Chambers, they always took in, people don't know about this, but in the early days of the New Deal, the Hisses basically opened their homes to anybody who was getting a job, who when they came to Washington to join the New Deal, they could go to Alger and Priscilla and at least find a place on the couch or on the floor.
If Alger Hiss was
That
not
was
a
his life.
spy, then he must have been framed.
Yes.
By whom and why?
They were after liberalism. They didn't like liberalism. They thought liberalism needed to be stopped. They thought that Franklin Roosevelt needed to be stopped. And if you remember, Alger was part of 1,400 people whose names were given to Francis Biddle to get fired as subversives in the administration in 1941. They were there. Isaac Don Levine had a personal problem with Roosevelt, and Ben Mandel, who was a friend of Whittaker Chambers, they worked together at HUAC, and they compiled these names, of which Alger was one of them. And it just went on from there. I think it became very personal with Ben Mandel because of his relationship with Whittaker Chambers in the 1930s.
Tony, was your father a communist or leaned to communism or
No.
sympathetic to communism?
No. I mean, the New Deal was willing to try lots of things that hadn't been tried before. And it was, President Roosevelt was famous for having said in a cabinet meeting, "Good morning, fellow socialists." But that just meant things were so bad, you had to try things and see what worked. And I think the other thing about Alger was that he didn't think of this as a career. He thought he was responding to a national emergency and would go back to a comfortable law practice once it was over. So he wasn't jockeying for position. And I think he didn't have a sense of when people might be out to get him. In some ways, that's an admirable quality. In some ways, it's not very self-protective.
Was he naive?
I don't know that naive. He was naive in the sense of not having a sense of danger, if you call it in an evolutionary sense, naive, but not as a person. He was a very thoughtful person. As you said, he manifested this, trying to teach himself how to be a good dad even though he was in prison.
Jeff, his case has led lots of people to say case closed. Clay Risen in his book Red Scare recently said essentially the same thing. Why do you think, on the basis of your research, that the case is now closed? How can you be so sure?
Well, first,
when
sure.
you know, there was a review and commentary by Javi Clare that was certainly damning and accused the conclusions of being delusional madness, which is far out criticism, certainly. But how can you be so sure when, you know, Russian sources and Soviet documents suggest that he was indeed involved in some way?
Well, 50 years of research will basically teach you how to go about doing that and teach you the answers. You asked before about Alger being a communist. So I actually spent the time looking into this. And it turned out that he was, the main point that they used against him was that he worked for a group called the International Juridical Association. This was a communist group. Well, I got 120,000 FBI files that were unredacted. And in one of those files was an interview with a guy named Shad Polaire, who was the person who hired people to work for the IJA. And it turned out that the circulation of the magazine was terrible. Nobody was reading it because it was so far left. He brings in his college buddy Alger Hiss as a moderating force, as a liberal as opposed to the communist, to help write this magazine or put together articles for the magazine so that more people would read it. And yet 20 years later, they're saying you're a communist because you joined this group.
But what about all the Soviet agents, spies, former spies, who say Alger Hiss was part of the organization, was helping us? Did they all just make this up to inflate their own self-importance?
Well, we haven't seen all of the files. We've seen pieces of the files, right? And Venona is a perfect case of, a perfect example of just seeing a piece of something. And I've had people say to me, well, what about Venona, right? Okay, well, have you read Venona? Have you looked at Venona? If you did the version of the Rosemary Stretch, it might seem like that's Alger Hiss. But the points raised in Venona simply don't describe Alger Hiss. They say, for instance, that this person, Ailes, was more interested in military material than civilian material. Yet the documents that showed up in the pumpkin papers and in Whittaker Chambers from the typewriter, civilian stuff, right, one after another. And then Priscilla Hiss was supposed to have typed this information up. Now you look at the original documents from which she typed it. This is the kind of research that I did that others didn't do. And it would turn out that she sometimes would summarize a document. And she would leave out from the summary the information that would have been of use to the Russians. Time and time again, it was done this way. It was clearly typed by somebody who kind of didn't know what they were doing. And this is the kind of thing that I kept finding over and over again. One of the big questions we looked in, and Tony was with me, with Tim Hobson, we went down to the house on 30th Street to see this thing.
In Washington.
In Washington. And Alger always said, if this trial took place in Washington, the jury would know this kind of neighborhood and would know how silly this was, that she was supposedly up night after night typing these documents. The neighbors to the south didn't hear anything. The neighbors to the north didn't hear anything. Neighbors across the street didn't hear anything. They heard Tim playing piano until it drove them crazy. And when Alger moved out, a sports writer moved in and was typing on deadline, and they couldn't sleep at night. And they never heard anything. And Tony was gracious enough to give me the Woodstock typewriter for a year. And one of the first things I did was take a tape recorder, put it 2 rooms away from my office, go back to my office and type on the machine, and then go back to the tape recorder and see if I heard it. Hear it clear as a bell. Why didn't anybody hear this? Well, because she didn't type the stuff.
Tony, how was it growing up as the son of Alger Hiss? Did you feel your entire life you were being defensive about this, or was it something you sort of took in stride?
Well, I hope I wasn't being defensive or offensive. It was something that you didn't imagine you would have to deal with, but when something comes up, you do deal with it, especially if you know that a wrong has been committed. I mean, I think what's so useful and helpful about Jeff's book is that for Clay Risen's book you just mentioned, Sam, I would tell people, please read that book. It has a lot of wonderful stuff in it, except about the Hiss case. Because he says, well, it's over and done with the Hiss case. In fact, what Jeff has demonstrated is that in some ways, research into the Hiss case is only just getting started. It's as if archaeologists had been excavating a field for years and reporting their findings, and suddenly someone came along and said, but this field is only a village that extends for miles and miles. And Jeff has introduced such an extraordinary mountain of new material that was either unavailable or overlooked, that in some ways the Hiss case is just getting started. Future historians will have to evaluate all of the things he's evaluated before they can say they're over and done with this.
So would you say the case is closed now,
I
or?
think it's just getting opened. It never closed, but only Jeff was able, let's say, to think beyond the pumpkin. And I mean that literally. In some ways, the great story that unwound during the trials and through the HUAC hearings that Nixon and Chambers put on was a monumental distraction from a pattern that was hard to discern, that there had been people for years already, this is what Jeff demonstrates, out to get Alger, people I never heard of. I learned a lot. So it's, and as you said, it's had an enormous impact on this country, both in terms of policy. Just last night at a forum we had here at CUNY Graduate Center, it came out that Joe McCarthy, who started his anti-Soviet crusade 3 weeks after Alger was convicted, had been planning that night to make a speech in favor of national health insurance. But he found a new cause.
And did indeed, and one that resonates very much today as well. Tony Hiss, thank you so much for joining us. And Jeff Kisseloff, the book is Rewriting History, a 50-year journey to uncover the truth about Alger Hiss. Fascinating reading because it's such a personal odyssey. That's it for this edition of Close Up, and for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. Don't forget to download the CUNY TV app where you can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.